how it shines in the dark.
They told us it's perfectly safe, you know?
Humans have always been seduced by things that glow in the dark. There is something in the architecture of your psychology, something old and animal and unresolved, that mistakes luminescence for divinity. A candle flame, a bioluminescent tide, a city glimpsed from an airplane at 30,000 feet. You see light where there is darkness, and something inside you decides instinctively before reason can intervene. That must be good. That must be safe. That must be the direction worth walking toward. I am a radium dial. I was made to tell time. Hung on wrists, pressed against mantelpieces, strapped to the dashboards of automobiles and the instrument panels of airplanes. I was precision and utility and modern elegance compressed into a circle of glass no wider than a silver dollar. And I glowed, God how I glowed, with that soft, impossible green-white light that made people stop in the middle of conversations, just to hold their wrist to the dark and watch me. What I'm about to tell you is not a ghost story. It is something more disturbing than that. It is the story of what happens when a civilization falls in love with a beautiful thing before it understands what that thing costs. It is the story of women, young, optimistic, extraordinarily ordinary women, who carried a slow catastrophe into their bodies one brushstroke at a time, while the men who profited from their labor told them, in memorandums, and in meeting rooms and in courtrooms, that they were imagining the damage. It is the story of how the dead taught the living to protect themselves, and it begins, as so many American tragedies do, with the irresistible promise of progress. Observation. The first, the luminescent lie. To understand what I was, you must first understand what radium meant in 1917. Marie Curie had isolated it less than 2 decades before, in 1898. Working in a converted shed in Paris with equipment that would embarrass a modern high school chemistry lab. She and her husband Pierre worked with radioactive pitchblende until their hands were so damaged they could barely grip a pen. She carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets. She kept a dish of radium salts on her bedside table because she loved to watch them glow. Her laboratory notebooks are still so radioactive that researchers today must sign waivers and handle them with protective gloves before they can read her handwriting. But the world did not know what radiation did yet. What the world knew was what it looked like, and it looked to a civilization drunk on modernity, like magic bottled into matter. The first 2 decades of the 20th century produced a radium craze that, viewed from a century's distance, reads like collective insanity. Physicians prescribed radium-infused water for fatigue and depression. Cosmetic companies blended radium into face creams and marketed them to fashionable women under names like Thoradia, a Paris-based brand, whose slogan, translated politely, promised that radium would restore youth to aging skin. There were radium toothpastes, radium hair tonics, radium suppositories, radium-laced chocolate bars sold as energy supplements. A Pennsylvania man named William Bailey made a fortune selling a product called Radithor, genuine radium dissolved in distilled water, which he advertised as a cure for over 150 ailments, including impotence and depression. He sold over 400,000 bottles before one of his most enthusiastic customers, a socialite and amateur athlete named Eben Byers, drank so much of it that his skull literally disintegrated. But that is a different story, and I do not want to lose the thread. What matters is the faith. The almost religious conviction shared by millions of ordinary Americans that radium was not just a scientific discovery but a gift, a benevolent force that nature had hidden inside certain minerals, waiting for humanity to grow wise enough to find it. Glowing things in the architecture of the early 20th century imagination were things that healed. Into this intoxicated cultural moment stepped the United States Radium Corporation, known in its earlier incarnation as the Radium Luminous Material Corporation and operating out of Orange, New Jersey. Their product was called Undark. Undark was a paint. Specifically, it was a mixture of radium salts, zinc sulfide, and a binder, and when applied to clock and watch dials, it produced a glow that required no external light source, no battery, no electricity. It was, for its era, miraculous. Military watches, aircraft instruments, navigational compasses, alarm clocks on bedside tables across America. All of them needed to be legible in the dark, and Undark made them so. The women who painted the dials, and they were almost exclusively women, because women's hands were considered smaller, more precise, more suited to delicate work, and also, critically because women could be paid less, were called dial painters. And in the years immediately following the First World War, a position at the Radium Dial Studio was not considered a hardship. It was, by the standards of the era, an extraordinary opportunity. The average American factory worker in 1917 earned somewhere between $12 and $15 a week. Experienced dial painters at U.S. Radium earned between $20 and $28 a week, almost triple the going rate for women's industrial labor. The studios were clean, the work was considered skilled. The girls brought their pay home and bought things their mothers had never owned. They saved for their own apartments. They sent money to younger siblings. They were, by every external measure, fortunate, and they glowed, not metaphorically. The paint adhered to their skin and clothing. Photographs taken of the studio at night. I have seen these photographs, and they are among the most quietly haunting images in American industrial history. Show the women luminous in the darkness, their faces and hair and hands shimmering with that soft green-white light, laughing, posed together, wholly unaware. They called themselves the Ghost Girls. They thought it was amusing. They would paint their teeth and their nails before evening's out so they glowed at the dance hall, and the young men who asked them to dance would lean close and marvel at the light coming off their skin. The foremen at U.S. Radium were aware by at least 1917 that their own physicists handled the radium compounds from behind lead shields, wearing protective gloves, limiting their exposure to the material with great care. The girls on the production floor knew nothing of this disparity. There is no evidence they were ever told. There is, as we will see later, considerable evidence they were actively lied to. The technique that made dial painting precise was called lip pointing. Radium paint is viscous. The camel hair brushes used to apply it would splay and lose their fine tip after a few strokes. To restore the point, the painter was instructed to press the brush between her lips, to use the surface, tension of saliva to draw the bristles back into a fine point. Then she would dip the brush in the radium compound, apply it to the dial face and repeat. Dip, point, paint, dip, point, paint. Each time she pointed that brush, she ingested a small quantity of radium. Some of the girls, eager to work quickly, or simply in the habit of holding brushes in their teeth between applications, ingested far more than a small quantity. Supervisors who raised concerns about the technique, and the record suggests there were at least a few internally, were told by management that the practice was harmless. One company memorandum, recovered decades later, instructed supervisors that if any worker expressed concern about ingesting paint, she should be told that radium was good for her constitution. They were not worried about you. They were worried about the paint supply. Hundreds of young women worked in those studios, across New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut. They arrived each morning into bright, cheerful workrooms. They chatted and laughed and painted their hundreds of dials per day. They went home luminous, and they thought the glow was beautiful, and they did not understand, could not have, been expected to understand that the beautiful thing they were carrying home on their skin and in their saliva and in the microscopic radium particles they breathed with every inhale was, with absolute biochemical certainty, going to kill them. It was just a matter of when. Observation. The second, the body as a crime scene. The first symptoms were teeth. There is something deeply unnerving about this. The way the body's catastrophe began in a place so intimate, so personal, so tied to the basic human act of eating and speaking and smiling. The dial painter's teeth began to ache in ways they could not explain. Then they began to crumble. Dentists would attempt extractions and find that the socket refused to heal, that instead the jawbone around the empty socket began to die, to decay, to rot while the patient was still living. Doctors, working without a framework to understand what they were seeing, diagnosed the women with a variety of conditions: phosphorus jaw, Loeffler's syndrome, poor dental hygiene. Some physicians who had served in the recent war recognized a disturbing similarity between the jaw deterioration they were seeing in the dial painters and the necrosis they had witnessed in soldiers exposed to chemical agents. But the connection between the women's workplace and their symptoms was not yet being made in any official capacity. Then came the anemia. The deep, intractable exhaustion that no amount of rest resolved. The spontaneous fractures, women who did not fall, who did not stumble, whose bones simply cracked under the ordinary pressure of walking or rising from a chair because the scaffolding inside them was collapsing, spines curved, hips dissolved. Young women who had danced at the hall on Saturday found themselves unable to lift their own arms by Monday. Let me explain the chemistry, because you need to understand this to understand the particular cruelty of what was happening. Radium sits in the same chemical family as calcium on the periodic table. It is, in the language of chemistry, a chemical analog, meaning the body cannot distinguish between them. When radium enters the human body, the body treats it exactly as it would treat calcium. It absorbs it. It transports it through the bloodstream with the same biological machinery used to carry dietary calcium, and then it deposits it permanently, with no mechanism for removal, into the bone marrow. Radium-226, the specific isotope in Undark, has a half-life of 1,600 years. This means that once it is in the bone for what is, in any meaningful human sense, forever. And there, embedded in the marrow that produces the body's blood cells, it radiates continuously. Alpha particles tear through adjacent tissue. DNA unravels. The cells responsible for producing new blood cannot function. The bone itself, bombarded from within, begins to break down. The women's bodies were not merely sick. They were being destroyed, systematically and from the inside, by a substance that had been deposited into the deepest structural material of their bodies with the body's own enthusiastic cooperation, because evolution had never needed to encode a defense against something that looked this much like calcium but behaved this catastrophically differently. And here is where the story shifts from tragedy into something more deliberate, something that requires a different word. The United States Radium Corporation was aware of the hazards of radium exposure as early as 1917, the same year they were instructing their dial painters to point their brushes with their lips and assuring worried workers that radium was good for their health. We know this not through inference or reconstruction. We know it through the documents. In 1925, Dr. Frederick Flynn, a physician hired by U.S. Radium, paid by U.S. Radium, examined several of the dial painters who had begun to show symptoms and declared them to be in fine health. He brought in a colleague, Dr. Cecil Drinker of Harvard, to conduct a wider study. Drinker's study found exactly what Flynn and U.S. Radium did not want found, that the dial painters were severely ill, that their workroom conditions were dangerous, and that the company bore responsibility for their condition. U.S. Radium obtained access to Drinker's report before it was published and I want you to understand that this is documented fact, altered it. They changed the conclusions. They submitted the falsified version to the State Labor Department. The altered report declared the plant safe. Dr. Drinker, when he eventually learned what had been done to his research, was furious. But by then, the machinery of corporate denial was fully operational. Meanwhile, the women were dying. Amelia Maggia, known to her co-workers as Molly, died in September 1922. She was 24. The official cause of death was listed as syphilis, a diagnosis her family furiously disputed, a diagnosis that carried with it a stigma calculated, whether consciously or not, to discourage inquiry. Irene Rudolph died in 1923. Helen Quinlan in 1924. Marguerite Carlo sued U.S. Radium in 1924 and settled out of court. She died shortly after. Hazel Vincent died. Ella Eckert died. The names accumulate with a terrible, rhythmic patience, like water wearing stone. U.S. Radium's internal communications during this period are a study in institutional self-preservation. Executives discussed the women's illnesses in the measured language of legal liability, not human tragedy. Medical consultants were retained not to treat the workers but to produce documentation that would be useful in court. When journalists began to investigate, the company engaged in a campaign of quiet intimidation, encouraging silence, disputing findings, leveraging the reflexive deference that ordinary citizens extended to large corporations and credentialed physicians. The company's position, maintained for years in the face of mounting evidence, was simple. There is no proof the paint caused these conditions. And technically, because of the way industrial disease law was written in the 1920s, they had a point. New Jersey's occupational disease statute had a 2-year window from the date of exposure during which a worker could file a claim. But radium poisoning does not announce itself in 2 years. The symptoms emerge slowly, over a decade. As the accumulated radiation dose reaches a threshold, the body can no longer survive quietly. By the time the dial painters understood what was happening to them, by the time any physician had connected their symptoms definitively to their work, the legal window had closed on every one of them. This was not, as it might appear, an accident of legislation. The law had been written by men for an industrial economy run by men to protect corporate interests from the unpredictable timelines of occupational disease. Whether or not the authors of that statute had anticipated the specific situation of a radium company using the law's limitations as a shield while its employees died, the effect was identical to if they had. The women were dying. The company was protected. The law was clear, and then 5 of those dying women decided they had nothing left to lose. Observation the third. The living dead fight back. Grace Fryer had been a dial painter at U.S. Radium from 1917 to 1920. By 1927, she was 29 years old, and her spine was so damaged by radium-induced bone destruction that she wore a metal back brace to remain upright. Her jaw had been partially removed by surgeons attempting, unsuccessfully, to arrest the necrosis spreading through the bone. She walked, on the days she could walk, with a gait that reflected the constant, deep pain of bones that were no longer performing the structural functions bones are meant to perform. She wanted to sue U.S. Radium. She had wanted to for 2 years. The problem was finding a lawyer willing to take the case. 2 years. 24 months of rejection. Attorneys who expressed sympathy and declined. Attorneys who reviewed the case and shook their heads at the statute of limitations. Attorneys who took one look at the defendant, a well-capitalized corporation with an in-house legal team and established relationships with the state medical bureaucracy, and calculated that the return did not justify the risk. The dial painters had become famous by this point, not in the way they would have chosen. The press had begun covering their story, and the coverage had the particular unpleasant flavor of spectacle. The living dead, one newspaper headline called them. Their photographs circulated. The images of young women in braces and wheelchairs visibly deteriorating sold papers. But notoriety is not the same as justice, and for 2 years, Grace Fryer's notoriety produced nothing but sympathy without remedy. Then she found Raymond Barry. Barry was a young attorney in Newark, recently in practice, without the established connections to corporate clients that might have made him cautious. He reviewed the case, recognized its legal novelty, and took it on contingency. 4 other former dial painters, Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, and Quinta McDonald, joined the suit. 5 women, a young attorney, and a corporation that had every reason to believe they would all be dead before the case concluded. The defense strategy was not subtle. It was delay. U.S. Radium's attorneys filed motions. They requested continuances. They challenged evidence and demanded additional examinations. They disputed jurisdiction and questioned standing. The legal machinery of obstruction, deployed by a well-funded defense with every incentive to wait, ground the proceedings down to an almost geological slowness. The strategy was transparent enough that contemporary observers noted it in print. The corporation was waiting for the plaintiffs to die, at which point the lawsuit would die with them, and the liability would evaporate. Catherine Schaub kept a journal during this period. She wrote about pain with a plainness that is more devastating than any rhetorical flourish could achieve. She wrote about the effort required to dress herself in the morning. She wrote about her frustration at attorneys who called her case hopeless and her gratitude for Barry, who did not. She wrote about the strange experience of being a body that was, by every measurable standard, demonstrably failing, while simultaneously being required to inhabit that body and navigate a legal system that moved at the pace of a civilization that did not share her urgency. Grace Fryer writes, and I am paraphrasing because her exact words belong to her, that she does not expect to live to see the verdict. She writes it without self-pity. She writes it as a fact, the way one writes down the weather. In April 1928, alarmed by the judge's reluctance to expedite the case and aware that the plaintiffs were deteriorating visibly, Barry filed for an emergency hearing on the grounds that the women were too ill to survive a normal legal timeline. The judge granted it. The hearing attracted international press. Reporters from France, from England, from across the United States filled the courtroom. Photographers waited outside. The 5 women appeared, in braces, in wheelchairs, assisted by family members, and their appearance in that courtroom was itself a form of argument that no motion, no deposition, no expert testimony could fully replicate. The jury of public opinion, if not yet the jury of the law, had seen them. The forensic evidence presented in the case was, by the standards of its time, genuinely innovative. Dr. Frederick Hoffman, a statistician and industrial disease researcher, had been documenting the dial painters' conditions since the early 1920s and had published findings linking their symptoms to radium exposure, findings that U.S. Radium had worked to discredit. But the most striking evidence came from a technique that measured radioactive gas in the women's breath. Radium-226 decays into radon, a radioactive gas. This means that a body saturated with radium is continuously exhaling radon. Researchers developed a method to measure radon levels in exhaled breath as a proxy for radium burden in the skeleton. The plaintiffs breathed into collection vessels. The measurements were taken. The readings confirmed, in objective, numerical, scientifically reproducible terms, what the women's crumbling bodies had been demonstrating for years. They were radiating from within, and the radiation source was identical to the material they had spent years ingesting at work. The bodies of the dial painters were, in the most literal forensic sense, their own evidence. The case settled out of court in June 1928, before a full verdict could be rendered. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, approximately $175,000 in contemporary currency, plus an annual pension of $600 for as long as they lived, and coverage of all medical expenses. The terms were presented by U.S. Radium's attorneys as a settlement, not an admission of liability. The company never formally acknowledged wrongdoing, but something had shifted, and the shift was not reversible. The Radium Girls case, the name by which Grace Fryer and her 4 co-plaintiffs would come to be known collectively, had established, in a jurisdiction that mattered, in a country that was watching, that a corporation could be held liable for occupational disease even when the disease developed years after the exposure had ceased. It had demonstrated that the statute of limitations, as written, was being used as a weapon against the very workers it was theoretically designed to protect, and it had placed in the public record the documented evidence that a major American corporation had known its workers were being poisoned, had hired physicians to cover it up, had falsified scientific reports, and had deployed the legal system to delay accountability until its accusers were dead. That evidence did not disappear when the case settled. It became the foundation on which other cases were built. 4th observation: dismantling corporate immunity. The Radium Girls did not live to see most of what their suffering built. Catherine Schaub died in 1933, Grace Fryer in 1933, Quinta MacDonald in 1929, Albina Larice in 1946. Edna Hussman survived until 1938. They died in stages across a decade, their bodies finally failing after years of slow collapse. But the legal and regulatory architecture that their case began to construct outlasted them by decades and continues to shape American labor law to this day. In 1949, New Jersey extended its statute of limitations to cover occupational diseases, explicitly closing the loophole that U.S. Radium had exploited. The extension was directly traceable to the public record created by the dial painters' lawsuit. Illinois, where a separate population of dial painters had worked and sued in the 1930s, made similar changes. The principle that a worker's right to sue for occupational illness should not expire before the illness becomes apparent, that the clock should begin not at the moment of exposure but at the moment of discovery, became established in American jurisprudence through the accumulated weight of cases that the Radium Girls precedent made possible. The dial painters case was one of the first high-profile demonstrations in American history that industrial exposure to toxic substances was not an unfortunate occupational hazard, but an actionable harm, that employers had a legal duty of care to their workers that extended to informing them of hazards and protecting them from exposure. This principle, seemingly obvious in retrospect, was not obvious in 1928. Workers were understood in the dominant legal and economic framework of the era as essentially disposable inputs, people who accepted risk as a condition of employment and had no particular recourse when that risk materialized in their bodies. The Radium Girls interrupted that framework. They did not dismantle it single-handedly. Labor movements, union organizing, and decades of legislative effort contributed to the dismantling. But they contributed something that legislative advocacy alone cannot produce: a face and a story, and a documented corporate crime, and a court record, and a public that had watched 5 dying women appear in a courtroom and demand to be counted. The Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed in 1970. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was established in 1972. The Toxic Substances Control Act in 1976. These are the formal legislative descendants of a lineage that runs directly through the dial painters case, through the industrial disease litigation of the 1930s and 1940s that followed their precedent, through a gradually accumulating national consensus that workers were not, in fact, disposable. Every safety regulation currently in force in American workplaces, every requirement to label hazardous materials, every mandate for protective equipment, every protocol for exposure monitoring, exists inside a legal architecture whose foundation includes the bones of Grace Fryer and the jawbone of Molly Maggia and the meticulous, agonizing documentation of 5 women who refused to die quietly. Observation the 5th, the shadow of the glow. The factory at 192 Alden Street, Orange, New Jersey, the building where the dial painters worked, where the brushes were, pointed on lips where the luminous paint dried on skin and hair and clothing and was breathed in with every ordinary breath, was demolished decades ago. In its place there is, depending on the year you check, either a parking lot or undeveloped land that the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection monitors as a radium contamination site. The radium is still there. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. The contamination present in the soil at the Alden Street site and at related sites across Orange and surrounding communities was deposited between roughly 1917 and 1926. It will remain at measurable, environmentally significant levels until approximately the year 3600. Residents of affected areas have over the decades found radium-contaminated soil in their backyards and in the foundations of their homes. Remediation efforts have been ongoing, partial, and persistently underfunded relative to the scale of the problem. The glow has not gone out. I am a radium dial, and I am old, and I have spent a century watching your kind mistake beautiful things for safe ones. The specific danger I represent has been contained, regulated, restricted, replaced with safer luminescent compounds that do not carry a 1,600-year half-life inside the bones of the people who handle them. This is the work of the Radium Girls, filtered through decades of advocacy and legislation, finally crystallized into enforceable law. But the pattern that produced me has not been contained. It reproduces. It finds new hosts, new substances, new situations in which the drive for profit and the refusal of inconvenient knowledge conspire to place the cost of production inside the bodies of the people doing the producing, while the people who profit stand behind a very modern equivalent of corporate memorandums and falsified reports and statutes of limitation. The workers in electronics manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia who handle rare earth elements without adequate protection. The Amazon warehouse employees whose bathroom break data is monitored by algorithms optimized for throughput, whose musculoskeletal injury rates run measurably higher than comparable workforces without that surveillance, and whose injuries are documented and then contested and then settled out of court in patterns that rhyme, at a distance of a century, with the pattern I watched play out in Orange, New Jersey. The gig workers classified as independent contractors because the contractor designation, like the 2-year statute of limitations, exists as a legal structure within which corporate liability can be made to disappear. The agricultural workers who move through fields still damp with pesticide residue because the regulatory gap between pesticide approval and field re-entry interval enforcement has not been closed, and the closing of it would cost money that someone has decided those workers' long-term health is not worth. These are not identical situations. I am not interested in false equivalences, but there is a shape to these stories, a recurring shape, a corporate grammar of denial and delay and deflection that I recognize because I watched it being written in the workrooms of US Radium, in the meetings where physicians were hired to produce helpful findings, in the courtroom strategies that counted on the plaintiffs to die before the verdict. Every regulation written to protect a worker from a known hazard was written because a specific human being, usually a working-class human being, usually a woman or a person of color, usually someone without the resources to absorb the loss, encountered that hazard without protection and was destroyed by it, and then either survived long enough to testify or died in a way that left enough evidence that someone else testified on their behalf. The regulations are not abstractions. They are the compressed, bureaucratic residue of individual suffering. The phrase OSHA requires adequate ventilation is the phrase Molly Maggia's jawbone rotted while she was still alive, run through decades of legislative process until it emerged as policy. The label that says, hazardous. Wear protective equipment is the voice of Grace Fryer in her metal back brace, appearing in a courtroom before a judge who needed to be persuaded that a dying woman's urgency should matter more than a corporation's. Procedural comfort. They did not live to see what they built, but they built it. With their bodies and their testimony and their refusal, extraordinary under the circumstances, extraordinary by any measure, to accept the proposition that their suffering was simply the cost of doing business in a modern economy. I am a radium dial. I have been sitting in darkness for 100 years, still faintly glowing, because I cannot stop, because it is my nature, because the half-life is what it is, and nothing in my chemistry permits me to simply cease. I have watched what was done with the knowledge I helped produce, the lawsuits, the legislation, the slow, imperfect, still unfinished construction of a world in which the equation of labor does not require human bodies to serve as the price of admission. You are still working on it. That is all right. The work was always going to take longer than one lifetime. The Radium girls understood this, I think, better than anyone. They filed their lawsuit knowing they would not survive to see its full consequences. They appeared in that courtroom in their braces and their wheelchairs, knowing that the primary effect of their appearance would be felt not by them, but by women they would never meet, working in factories not yet built, making products not yet invented, protected by regulations not yet written. They did it anyway. The very least that the living can do for the dead is carry what they learned forward into rooms where decisions are made, into conversations about who bears the cost of production, into courtrooms and legislatures and corporate boardrooms in the quiet, consequential moment when someone in a position of knowledge decides whether to say what they know or to protect what they profit from. The Radium girls could not protect themselves. They did not know enough, soon enough. They had been told, by people they had no particular reason to distrust, that the glowing thing was harmless, and they believed it. Because it is human to believe the things that the powerful and the credentialed assert, but they learned, at a cost that cannot be overstated, in a timeline that afforded them no mercy, they learned what the glow cost. And they made sure that learning did not die with them. Every regulation is a debt to the past. Pay it forward.